The EU is about to dish out a ruling related to Activision and Microsoft, and it doesn't look good. But that might be expected. Oh, the ebbs and flows of the courts, the regulatory bodies, and Microsoft trying to spend $70 billion dues to acquire Activision. The news just keeps flowing, and we're looking at the regulatory bodies that are ahead, and Microsoft has a big one on the horizon, and that is the EU, because by November 8th, the EU will issue a ruling, at least a preliminary ruling, on Microsoft trying to acquire Activision. Now, there's a lot at stake here. There's a lot of lobbying. The EU's talking to a lot of people. Microsoft says they're talking to the EU. Everybody's talking to the EU. And so we're getting some early information that looks like the ruling may not be where Microsoft exactly wants it, but I think that's honestly probably expected. So a little bit of a recap here. On the smaller markets like Brazil and Saudi Arabia, Microsoft just sailed right through. In the UK, Microsoft is now what's in a phase 2 review, and where they are taking a closer look at the acquisition. And now the EU is expected to go into a quote-unquote phase 2 review as well. This comes from Politico, who was able to scoop up some information that says, hey, look, it looks like this is going to be happening. And more specifically, what's really interesting about this is that Microsoft had until November 1st to file sort of a document, if you will, that says, look, these are some of the concessions or things that we are willing to do to make this happen. And they pretty much said, look, we're not willing to do everything. We think we should sail right through. Now that, on the surface, sounds like a really, really bold take that Microsoft just shows up and be like, hey, just do what we say and everything will be fine. Now, that is not exactly how they are saying it here, and they're certainly playing up to the concerns. Obviously, Phil Spencer has said time and time again that Call of Duty will remain on PlayStation for the foreseeable future. But realistically, when you're trying to think about negotiation tactics here, I personally think that Microsoft fully expected this, even though Satya Nadella continues to be very confident in his remarks that they're confident they will be able to close it. I suspect Microsoft thought this was more than likely going to happen. After all, Microsoft is a $1 trillion company, and they're trying to spend $70 billion to take a big pool of content out of the gaming segment and put it into their portfolio. Of course, it's pretty logical that was going to be reviewed. Now, the reason why I think Microsoft expected this and why Microsoft didn't file any concessions or any other additional information by that November 1st deadline is if you're expecting to go into a phase 2 review, what benefits do you gain? Maybe they could have tried to think they could head off this review by doing that, but I suspect they're saying, look, we fully expect a phase 2 review to happen. It's going to happen. And so why would we give everything up front? From a pure negotiation tactic point, right? They go into the phase 2 and be like, look, okay, you guys made some points or whatever. We'll negotiate and we'll make some concessions here, or just align on some assets or whatever we got to do to get this closed. And that happens during phase 2. And then from that standpoint, some of the headlines make a bit more sense because it's real easy to be like, Microsoft says we're not going to do anything to close this. Well, the reality is they don't want to play their cards up front because they fully expected phase 2 to happen. It's just, they're that large. They are that large of a company, and it's expected. So either way, November 8th is right around the corner, and we should get more information about what's going to happen here. But the reality is, the fact that the EU is going to do this, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the US follow a similar path, but we don't know what's actually happening in these conversations directly between the EU and Microsoft. Now, Satya Nadella, the CEO, does, and Phil Spencer obviously does, and he has again remained confident that they would be able to close this. So maybe the conversations aren't so dark as some of the headlines might make it seem, that Microsoft isn't going to be able to get this through now that the EU is looking at a quote unquote scary phase 2. We will find out. We don't have to wait too much longer, but I think optimistically, though, June 30th is going to be the earliest that Microsoft will actually get this closed. You think about it, if the EU is going to go into a phase 2, let's just say they announce that on November 8th, that's going to take some time. And we have a lot of holidays coming up. We have Thanksgiving here in the US, which may not necessarily always impact the EU, but Christmas certainly will. And the New Year certainly will. And so we're looking at sometime probably early to late next year, meaning early to late, like Q1, Q2 timeline, I think is when we'd start to see things start to sort of bubble out, if you will, from these conversations. And that's lining almost exactly to Microsoft's ability and initial prediction of closing by June 30th, which really just kind of shows that everybody who said, oh, it'll close in August of this year, were completely and absolutely wrong. Now, on the heels of this news, Sony actually released their earnings today. And from the PlayStation side, it's a little bit interesting and could very easily be skewed to make it look like Sony's hurting because of this. But I don't think that's actually the case. So, for Sony's earnings on the PlayStation side, they sold 3.3 million PS5s. That is flat. That is a flat, no growth year over year. But Sony has now sold 25 million PS5s. Also, this is where it gets a little bit more important here. They had 45.4 million PS Plus subscribers. It's hard to say that, but that is down 4%. So previously they had 47.3 and now they are at about 45.4-ish. Now, they also had in software sales, they had 62.5 million in software sales, which is down 18%, and also 102 million PSN active users, which again is down 2%, which you can see those numbers down there at the bottom in the Q2 segment, and it's kind of highlighted in a light gray. Now, the interesting thing here is actually Sony's overall revenue was up. Now, remember, they announced, I believe it was earlier this year, they announced a bunch of different tiers and some rejiggering of how they were configuring their PlayStation SKUs for online play. And so what it sounds like is they actually had fewer people, and that doesn't sound like that, I mean, this is the reality. They had fewer people subscribing, but because the rates and bundles went up, they actually made more money this quarter than they did with more subscribers last quarter. So just kind of keep that in mind when you read the headlines that, hey, yes, they did go down, but they also made more money. And so obviously Sony is probably the largest lobbying effort, at least that we know of so far, that is really pushing back against this Activision acquisition. And so they could come out and say, like, look, we're already losing subscribers. It's a tough business, and Microsoft taking this stuff away could really harm us. But then on the other side of Microsoft, it could be like, look, you guys made more money than you did previously. And so clearly Call of Duty wasn't even out during this time. So it doesn't really impact you. And so the big dates ahead, we still haven't heard much out of the U.S. courts. The U.S. courts could surprise and be like, hey, they're fine. Let's just make them happen. We still have to get through what the EU is, and then there's still the UK. So Microsoft was very far from being out in the clear about its acquisition of Activision, who just, by the way, launched Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, although that information is not surprising everybody. And of course, it sounds like they are having another big success with this release, and it sounds like they're doing pretty well. And so there's also the argument that Activision will be perfectly fine if these two parties are not able to complete the agreement. If the courts come and say, like, look, Activision, you just got to stay by yourself, and life goes on. And that is one of the primary reasons why every time there's an acquisition, with companies like Microsoft, while they have intent to buy them, they can't actually make any financial decisions or really any decisions for a company like Activision, because, hey, what if they just steered that thing right off a cliff accidentally or intentionally, and then all of a sudden the courts say, like, look, you guys got to stay separated, and so you guys understand where that is going. So those are the big kind of bits of information that are linking all this stuff together. So I really find this stuff fascinating, and if you do too, make sure to keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.